The Composer and the Countess. Chapter 1. The Widow and the Waif. The autumn of 1874 arrived in London like a poorly tuned orchestra, damp, discordant, and full of melancholy promise. For Countess Arabella Vane, the season brought little joy. At 32, she had been a widow for 3 years, having lost her husband, the Earl of Ashworth, to a putrid fever that had swept through their country estate with unseemly haste. Society had been kind enough in its mourning period, allowing her the requisite year of black crape and seclusion. But now, with the mourning clothes packed away in lavender-scented trunks, Arabella found herself adrift in a world that no longer knew what to do with her. She was too young to retire to the dowager's dower house, too wealthy to be pitied, and too independent to remarry the sort of titled boor who would view her as a decorative addition to his debt-ridden lineage. Her fortune, inherited outright from the Earl, who had possessed the decency to die without male issue, was considerable. Her reputation, thus far, was spotless, and her boredom was absolute. On a grey Tuesday afternoon, Arabella sat in the drawing-room of her Mayfair townhouse, staring at the cold fireplace as if it might spontaneously offer her a solution. Her companion, Mrs. Hester Finch, a round woman of 50 with the constitution of a draught horse and the discretion of a tomb, sat nearby with her embroidery. "You've sighed 7 times in the last hour, my lady," Hester observed, without looking up. "If you intend to reach an 8th, I shall be forced to fetch the smelling salts." "I am not unwell, Hester. I am simply—" Arabella searched for the word. "Unemployed." Hester's needle paused. "You are a countess with an income that could purchase a small principality. You are not employed at all." Precisely the problem. Arabella rose from her chair and moved to the window, where rain streaked the glass like tears. "I have no purpose. I attend charity galas where ladies in borrowed diamonds congratulate themselves for feeding orphans. I endure dinner parties where men discuss the price of guano as if it were poetry. I sit on committees for hospitals I shall never visit and libraries I shall never read in. I am a decorative ghost, Hester, and I find it insufferable." Hester set down her embroidery. For all her plain speech and practical manner, she understood her mistress better than anyone. "What would you do if you could do anything?" The question hung in the air. Arabella turned from the window, her grey eyes, the colour of winter seas, suddenly bright. "I would do something that matters, something that outlasts me. I have money, Hester, more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, and London is full of talent starving in garrets while mediocrity is applauded in salons. Why should I not become a patroness?" "A patroness of what?" "Music," Arabella said, as if the word had been waiting on her tongue for years. "The Earl despised music, you know. He called it feminine frivolity and forbade the pianoforte in this very house. I have not heard a living note within these walls since his death. But I remember as a girl, before my father sold me to the Earl like a prize heifer. I remember the way music could lift the heart until it felt too large for the chest. I want that back, and I want to give it to others." Hester regarded her for a long moment. "You know what they will say. A young widow taking a personal interest in an artist, especially a male artist, the gossip will be vicious." "Let them talk." Arabella's chin lifted. "I have been silent for 3 years. I have worn their black, accepted their condolences, and smiled at their insinuations that I must be desperate for a second husband. I am done with silence." And so it was decided. 3 weeks later, Arabella found herself in a part of London that polite society pretended did not exist. The address had come to her through a circuitous route. A cousin of a cousin who knew a violinist who had once played with a composer named Julian Hart. The rooms were in Soho, in a building that leaned against its neighbours like a drunkard against a lamppost. The stairs were narrow and smelled of boiled cabbage and coal smoke. Arabella, dressed in a simple blue gown that cost more than most families earned in a year, picked her way upward with Hester trailing behind. "This is highly irregular," Hester muttered for the 12th time. "You have mentioned it." At the top of the 3rd flight, a door stood ajar. From within came the sound of a pianoforte, not the polite, tinkling instrument of a drawing room, but something fiercer. The notes were not arranged in the orderly progression of a sonata. They seemed to wrestle with one another, climbing, falling, reaching for something just beyond their grasp. Arabella paused on the landing, her hand on the rough wooden rail, and listened. The music was unlike anything she had heard. It was not beautiful in the conventional sense. It was angular and restless, full of dissonances that resolved too late or not at all. It was the sound of a man trying to build a cathedral out of splinters, and it moved her in a way that the polished performances at the Royal Albert Hall never had. She knocked. The music stopped abruptly. A moment later, the door was pulled open by a man who looked as though he had not slept in a week. He was tall, perhaps 30, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the colour of burnt whiskey. His clothes were shabby, frock coat threadbare at the elbows, cravat undone, boots scuffed to the colour of old tea. His hands, Arabella noticed, were extraordinary. Long fingers, pianist's fingers, stained with ink at the tips. He stared at her. She stared back. "You are Julian Hart," she said. "I am." His voice was rougher than she expected, as if he had not spoken to anyone in days. "And you are lost, madam. The dressmakers are 3 streets over." Arabella felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "I am not a dressmaker's client today. I am a patroness. My name is Countess Arabella Vane. I have heard your music, Mr. Hart, and I wish to speak with you about it." For a long moment, he did not move. Then, with the air of a man who had nothing left to lose, he stepped aside. "You had better come in then, but I warn you, I have no tea, and the only chair has a broken leg." The room was smaller than her dressing closet. A battered pianoforte dominated the space, its keys yellowed and its frame scarred with candle wax. Sheets of manuscript paper covered every surface, the floor, the windowsill, even the empty coal scuttle. The air was cold and smelled of turpentine and exhaustion. Julian Hart watched her take it in, his arms crossed over his chest. He did not offer her the chair. She did not ask for it. "Why?" he said finally. "Why what?" "Why are you here? I have heard of patronesses before. They are usually 60, dowdy, and looking for a charitable project to discuss at their dinner parties. You are none of those things." His gaze was direct, almost to the point of rudeness. "So I ask again, why?" Arabella could have been offended. Instead, she felt something she had not felt in years, the spark of genuine engagement. This man did not care about her title or her fortune. He cared only about the answer to his question. "Because I heard your music from the landing," she said, "and it made me feel something I thought I had lost. I do not know if you are a great composer, Mr. Hart. I do not know if you ever will be. But I know that you are a true one, and I would rather spend my money on a true artist who fails than on a false one who succeeds." Julian's arms uncrossed slowly. He looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time, not as a countess, not as a woman, but as a possibility. "You are either very brave or very foolish. I am told they are often the same thing." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. It transformed him. The weariness remained, but beneath it Arabella glimpsed something else, a hunger, not for food or comfort, but for recognition, for someone to believe. "What do you propose?" he asked. "I propose to sponsor you. A stipend, sufficient to free you from whatever hack work you are doing to survive. A proper pianoforte, delivered to these rooms or to better ones, as you prefer, access to a copyist, and when you have completed a work worthy of performance, I will arrange a concert." Julian's expression flickered through several emotions: disbelief, suspicion, and finally a cautious hope that he seemed almost ashamed to feel. "And what do you want in return?" "Your best work," Arabella said simply. "Nothing more. I do not require dedication, flattery, or even gratitude. I require only that you write the music that is in you, and that you allow me to be the first to hear it." The silence stretched between them. Outside, the rain began again, tapping against the grimy window. Julian Hart looked down at his ink-stained hands, then back at the Countess, standing in the middle of his squalid room like a bird that had flown in through an open window. "You are mad," he said quietly. "Quite possibly. And you will regret this." "I doubt it." He held out his hand. She took it. His grip was warm and calloused, the grip of a man who had spent his life at the keyboard. It was not the limp, gloved handshake of the drawing room. It was real. "Then you have a composer, my lady," Julian said. "God help you." Chapter 2. The Harmony of Proximity. 6 months later, Julian Hart was no longer starving. He was, however, profoundly unsettled. The stipend the Countess had arranged was generous enough to allow him to move from the Soho garret to a modest but respectable set of rooms in Bloomsbury. The new pianoforte, a Broadwood grand, delivered with such care that the movers had removed their boots at the door, stood in the centre of the room like a black stallion awaiting a rider. He had paper, ink, and the luxury of time, and yet he wrote nothing. Oh, he composed. That was not the problem. The problem was that everything he wrote felt wrong, too safe, too polite, too eager to please an audience he had never respected. He would sit at the keyboard for hours, his fingers finding chords that were perfectly acceptable and utterly lifeless. Then he would tear the manuscript from the rack, crumple it, and hurl it into the growing pile by the fireplace. The truth, which he admitted to no one, was that he had lost his voice. And he suspected the Countess was the reason. Arabella Vane visited him every Tuesday and Thursday at 3 o'clock. She arrived in a different gown each time: emerald silk, dove grey velvet, sapphire wool, always exquisite, always understated, always smelling faintly of violets. She would sit in the chair by the window, a new chair, purchased after she had complained of the old one's lumps, and listen as he played whatever fragment he had managed to produce since her last visit. She never criticised. She never praised falsely. She listened with her whole body, her head slightly tilted, her hands still in her lap, her grey eyes fixed on his fingers, as if she could see the music taking shape beneath them. And when he finished, she would sit in silence for a moment before speaking. "That passage in the minor key," she said one afternoon, after he had played a particularly insipid sonata movement. "It wanted to go somewhere else, did it not? You restrained it." Julian's hands froze above the keys. "Restrained it. You wrote a resolution that was correct but not true. The music was reaching for a different chord, something darker, perhaps. You gave it light instead. Why?" He turned on the bench to face her. "Because no one wants darkness, my lady. Audiences want prettiness. They want to be soothed, not disturbed." "I am not an audience," Arabella said quietly. "I am a patroness, and I did not sponsor you to write prettiness." The words struck him like a slap. He had spent years chasing commissions from people who wanted waltzes for their daughters' debuts or patriotic anthems for their charitable societies. He had learned to give them what they asked for, bland and forgettable, in exchange for enough coin to keep body and soul together. And now, here was a woman telling him that she wanted the truth instead. "You do not know what you are asking," he said. "Then show me." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the keyboard, closed his eyes, and played the passage again. This time, he did not turn away from the darkness. He let the minor key descend into a diminished seventh, harsh and unresolved, and held it there until the dissonance seemed to fill the room like smoke. When he opened his eyes, Arabella was smiling. Not the polite social smile of the drawing room, but something real and slightly fierce. "There," she said, "that is why I came to your garret." From that day, something shifted between them. Julian began to write in earnest, not sonatas for polite consumption, but a symphony. It would be his first, a work of such scale and ambition that it terrified him, even as he sketched its outlines. He worked with a ferocity he had not known he possessed, often through the night, until the candles burned to stubs and the dawn crept through the curtains like a thief. And through it all, there was Arabella. She was there on the afternoons when the music would not come, sitting in her chair with a book she did not read, offering the simple comfort of her presence. She was there when he played a new passage, her brow furrowed in concentration, her occasional questions sharper and more insightful than any music master's. She was there when he despaired, when he declared the symphony a failure and himself a fraud, and she did not argue with him. She simply waited until his storm had passed, then asked him to play again. It was intimate in a way neither of them acknowledged. They never touched, save for the brief handshake of their first meeting. They never spoke of anything personal, not his childhood, not her marriage, not the long years of loneliness that had shaped them both. They maintained the careful fiction of patron and artist, two people united by a common purpose and nothing more. But the walls of the room knew otherwise. They witnessed the way Julian's hands would tremble slightly when Arabella leaned close to examine a score. They saw the way her breath would catch when he played a passage of unexpected tenderness. They heard the silences between them, heavy with words that would not be spoken. The first crack in the facade came on a June evening when a sudden storm trapped Arabella at Julian's rooms past her usual hour. The rain fell in sheets, turning the streets to rivers and making the gaslights flicker like nervous ghosts. Hester, who accompanied her on every visit, had gone to fetch the carriage and been unable to return. "You will have to wait," Julian said, standing at the window with his hands behind his back. "The storm will pass." "And if it does not?" Arabella asked from her chair. She had removed her gloves, a small intimacy that made Julian's throat tighten, and was rubbing her fingers as if they were cold. "Then I shall build an ark." She laughed, a sound she rarely made in his presence. It was low and warm, like honey dissolving in tea. "I did not know you had a sense of humour, Mr. Hart." "I have many things you do not know, my lady." The words hung in the air. He had not meant them to sound the way they did, intimate, almost accusing, but he did not take them back. Arabella looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight caught the curve of her cheek, the faint lines at the corners of her eyes that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure. She was beautiful, but it was not her beauty that undid him. It was the stillness in her, the sense of depths he could not fathom. "What things?" she asked softly. Julian turned from the window. He knew he should say something safe, something that would restore the distance between them. But the storm had made the room feel like a ship at sea, detached from the world, and he was tired of safety. "I know that you are lonely," he said. "I know that you come here not because you love music, though you do, but because it is the only place where you do not have to be the Countess. I know that you married a man who did not see you, and that you have spent 3 years wondering if anyone ever will." Arabella's face did not change, but her hands had stopped moving. "That is presumptuous." "It is true." "And what of you, Mr. Hart? What do I know of you?" "Nothing," he said. "That is the difference. You have given me everything, money, time, belief, and I have told you nothing of myself, not why I compose, not what I have lost, not why I cannot sleep at night. Why can you not sleep?" The question was direct, without artifice. It demanded an answer. Julian walked to the pianoforte and ran his fingers along the lid, feeling the cool, polished wood. Because when I close my eyes, I hear the music that should exist but does not. It is there, just beyond my reach, perfect and whole, and every day I sit at this instrument trying to capture it, and every day I fail. That is the truth of me, my lady. I am a man haunted by a masterpiece he cannot write. The rain hammered against the windows. The candles guttered, and Arabella Vane, Countess of Ashworth, rose from her chair and crossed the room to stand beside him. "Then let me help you find it," she said. She did not touch him, but she stood close enough that he could feel the warmth of her, smell the violets in her hair. And for one suspended moment, the world contracted to the space between them, the space where patron and artist dissolved into something older and more dangerous. The carriage arrived. Hester's voice called up the stairs. Arabella stepped back, and the spell broke. "Until Thursday, Mr. Hart," she said, her voice steady. "Until Thursday, my lady." She left, and Julian stood alone in the candlelit room, his heart pounding like a kettle drum, knowing that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. Chapter 3. The Dissonance of Scandal. The whispers began in July. They were the usual sort, the currency of a society that had nothing better to do than speculate about the lives of others. A young widow visiting a bachelor's rooms twice a week, no chaperone beyond a paid companion who could be bought or bullied into silence. Hours spent behind closed doors, the pianoforte providing a respectable excuse that fooled no one who wished to be fooled. It began with a single letter, anonymous and vicious, delivered to Arabella's townhouse on a Tuesday morning. Does the Earl's money buy you only a musician, or does it buy his other services as well? The neighbourhood would like to know. Arabella read the letter twice, her face expressionless, then she folded it neatly and placed it in the fire. "Who was it from?" Hester asked from the doorway. "No one worth naming. My lady, I said it is nothing." But it was not nothing. Over the following weeks more letters arrived, the language grew uglier, the accusations grew bolder. By August, the whispers had become open talk in the clubs and drawing rooms of Mayfair. Arabella received 3 fewer invitations to dinner parties than she had the previous month. 2 of her charitable committees quietly suggested that her presence was no longer required. Julian heard the rumours too, though later and from less reliable sources. His landlady looked at him differently. The man who delivered his coal made a comment that was almost a sneer. And when he walked through the streets of Bloomsbury, he imagined he could feel eyes on his back, not admiring, but appraising, as if he were a kept thing. He did not tell Arabella what he heard. She did not tell him about the letters. They continued their Tuesdays and Thursdays, speaking only of the symphony, which had grown into something vast and terrible and beautiful. The first movement was complete, the second was nearly so, and the third, the adagio, was the thing that haunted Julian's dreams. He wrote it for her. He did not say so, but she knew. It was a movement of aching tenderness, full of melodic lines that reached toward each other across bars of silence, yearning for a resolution that never quite came. When he played it for her for the first time, Arabella wept. Not loudly, not dramatically. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, and she brushed it away as if it were an inconvenience. But Julian saw it, and his heart broke a little. "It is the most beautiful thing I have ever heard," she said. "It is not finished," he replied. "I do not know how to finish it. Perhaps it does not need finishing. Perhaps it is meant to yearn." He looked at her, really looked, and saw the cost she was hiding, the shadows beneath her eyes, the way her hands clenched in her lap, the careful brightness of her voice, like varnish over cracked wood. "What has happened?" he asked. "Nothing." Arabella. It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it seemed to echo in the room, louder than any chord. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, the tears were there again, unshed. "They are destroying me, Julian. Not with swords or poison, with whispers, with invitations withdrawn and letters unanswered, with smiles that do not reach the eyes and hands that do not touch. I have been erased from the society I was born to, and all because I chose to spend my money on something I love instead of on another useless title. Julian stood up from the pianoforte. He wanted to go to her, to take her hands, to promise her that he would make it right, but he did not know how. He was a composer without a name, a man whose greatest achievement was still unwritten. What could he offer a countess? "I will stop coming," he said, "if that is what you need." Her head snapped up. "No. If the visits are the cause of the scandal is not the cause, it is the excuse. They have been waiting for 3 years to tear me down, Julian. A widow with money and no husband to control her. I am an offence to everything they believe. If it were not you, it would be someone else, a footman, a dancing master, a portrait painter. They would find a reason." "Then what do we do?" Arabella stood. She walked to him slowly, as if measuring every step. When she was close enough to touch, she stopped. "We finish the symphony," she said. "We give them something real to talk about. And then we decide what we are willing to lose." The decision came sooner than either of them expected. It was September, and the symphony was nearly complete. Only the ending of the adagio remained, the resolution that Julian could not find, no matter how many times he played the passage. He had written a dozen versions, each more desperate than the last, and discarded them all. Arabella arrived on a Thursday afternoon to find him slumped over the keyboard, his head in his hands. The manuscript paper on the rack was blank. "It will not come," he said without looking up. "I have tried everything, every chord, every key, every possible path. The music refuses to end." "Perhaps because it does not want to end," she said gently. "Perhaps because you are afraid of what comes after." He lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, his jaw shadowed with stubble. What comes after is a concert, a performance, the judgment of an audience that has already decided I am either a genius or a fraud. And then, what? You return to your empty townhouse, and I return to my empty rooms, and we pretend that this year meant nothing. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "No." The word was torn from him, raw and unwilling. "It is not what I want. I want, God help me, Arabella, I want you, not as a patroness, not as a friend, as everything, and I cannot have you, because you are a countess and I am a nobody, because society would crush us both, because the scandal would destroy your name and my career before it has even begun." He stood up from the bench, sending the stool skittering across the floor. He paced to the window, then back, his hands shaking. "Do you know what they call me now?" he said. "The Countess's pet composer, her little project, her toy. I have heard the words they use when they think I cannot hear, and every one of them is a knife, because they are not wrong. I am your project, I am your charity, and if I touch you, if I so much as hold your hand, I prove them right." Arabella did not move. She stood in the centre of the room, her grey eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his chest ache. "You are not my project," she said. "You have never been my project. You are the first person in my entire life who has looked at me and seen not a title or a fortune, but a woman. You play for me as if I matter, as if my opinion matters. And I have spent this year falling in love with you, Julian, not because you are talented or promising or any of the other words they use, but because you are kind, because you are brave, because you write music that makes me feel less alone in the world." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the street outside seemed to hold its breath. "You cannot say that," Julian whispered. "I just did. Do you understand what will happen? If anyone finds out—" "Everyone has already found out. The scandal is here, Julian. It arrived months ago. The only question is whether we will let it destroy something that never existed, or whether we will give it something real to destroy." He crossed the room in 3 strides. He took her face in his hands, those long, ink-stained fingers cradling her jaw as if she were made of glass, and he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate and hungry and full of all the months of longing they had denied themselves. She rose on her toes to meet him, her hands gripping the lapels of his threadbare coat, and for a moment the world outside ceased to exist. There was only this, the press of lips, the warmth of breath, the impossible rightness of 2 people who had finally stopped pretending. When they broke apart, Julian rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since the moment you walked into my garret and told me I was a true artist. I thought you were an angel. I thought you would vanish if I blinked." "I am not going to vanish," Arabella said, "but we have to decide. Now, tonight. Do we hide? Do we pretend this never happened? Or do we walk into the fire together and trust that something will survive?" Julian looked at the pianoforte, at the blank manuscript paper, at the unfinished adagio that had tormented him for weeks, and suddenly he knew how it ended. He released her gently and walked to the keyboard. He sat down, his fingers finding the keys, and he played the resolution he had been searching for. It was not a grand, triumphant chord. It was not a sad, resigned one. It was something in between, a quiet acceptance, a choice made without regret. The melody reached across the silence and found its match at last. When he finished, Arabella was crying in earnest, but she was smiling too. "That," she said, "is how it ends." He stood and took her hand. "No," he said, "that is how it begins." Chapter 4. The Finale. The concert was scheduled for the first week of December in St. James's Hall, a venue far grander than anything Julian had dared to imagine. Arabella had arranged it all: the orchestra, the conductor, the publicity, the printing of programs. She had done so openly, defiantly, in full view of the society that had turned its back on her. The scandal had not abated. If anything, it had intensified. The letters continued to arrive. The invitations had stopped altogether. Arabella had been asked to resign from her last remaining committee, and 2 of her oldest friends had crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. But something else had happened as well. Other letters had begun to arrive, from strangers mostly, young women who thanked her for her courage, elderly gentlemen who wrote to say that they, too, had once loved someone society deemed unsuitable, artists of every stripe who saw in her patronage a validation of their own precarious lives. She was no longer merely a countess, she was a symbol, and while symbols were dangerous things to become, they were also powerful. Julian had not left his rooms in a week. He was preparing the orchestral parts, checking every note, every dynamic marking, every bowing instruction. The symphony was finished, truly finished, with the adagio's resolution now fixed exactly as he had played it that night. He had not changed a single note since. He was terrified, not of the music was good. He knew that now, with a certainty he had never felt before. It was the best thing he had ever written, and he suspected it might be the best thing he would ever write. What terrified him was the prospect of losing Arabella, not to scandal, but to the ordinary erosion of time. What if the concert failed? What if it succeeded? What if the world that had rejected them suddenly welcomed them back, and in doing so, smoothed away the edges that had brought them together? These were the thoughts that plagued him on the morning of the concert. He was sitting at the pianoforte, not playing, just staring at the keys, when a knock came at the door. It was Arabella. She was dressed in silver-grey silk, her hair pinned up with pearls, her face composed, but her eyes gave her away. They were bright with fear and love in equal measure. "You should not be here," Julian said. "Someone will see." "Let them." She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "I came to give you something." She held out her hand. In her palm lay a small velvet box. Julian opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a signet ring, not valuable, not antique, but engraved with a single word: courage. "It belonged to my mother," Arabella said. "She gave it to me on my wedding day, and I have worn it every day since. But today, I think you need it more than I do." Julian looked at the ring, then at her. "I cannot take this." "You can. You will. And when you walk onto that stage tonight, you will remember that you are not alone, that I am in the audience, and I believe in you, and nothing they say or do can change that." He slipped the ring onto his little finger. It was too small, but he did not care. He took her hand and pressed it to his lips. "Whatever happens tonight," he said, "I want you to know that this year has been the only year of my life that mattered. Before you, I was just writing notes. With you, I wrote a symphony." Arabella leaned forward and kissed him softly. "Go," she said. "Make me proud." St. James's Hall was full. The audience was a strange mixture: the curious, the hostile, the hopeful, and the genuinely musical. Society had turned out in force, not because they expected to hear a masterpiece, but because they expected to see a scandal. The Countess's box was the most talked-about seats in the house, and every opera glass in the room had been trained upon it since the doors opened. Arabella sat in the front of the box, Hester beside her, her hands folded in her lap. She did not look at the other boxes. She did not acknowledge the whispers that rose like smoke around her. She kept her eyes fixed on the empty conductor's podium and waited. The orchestra filed in. The conductor, a stern German named Klemperer, who had agreed to the engagement only after hearing the score, took his place. There was a hush. And then Julian Hart walked onto the stage. He was dressed in a new black coat, purchased with the last of his stipend. His hair had been cut, his chin shaved. He looked, for the first time, like the composer he had always dreamed of becoming. But his hands were shaking as he took his seat at the pianoforte. The conductor raised his baton. The symphony began. The first movement was a storm, a torrent of sound that seemed to break every rule of harmony and form. The audience shifted in their seats. Some frowned. Others leaned forward, intrigued. A few, who had come only to sneer, looked confused. The second movement was a dance, but a strange one, a waltz that stumbled and recovered, that laughed and wept in the same breath. It was music of profound ambivalence, the sound of a man who had learned to find beauty in imperfection. Then came the adagio. From the first notes, something shifted in the hall. The restlessness stilled. The whispers ceased. Even the most hostile members of the audience found themselves caught in the web of that slow, yearning melody. It was the heart of the symphony, the secret Julian had been afraid to tell. It was a love letter, set to music, for all the world to hear. In her box, Arabella pressed her hand to her chest. The tears came, and she did not wipe them away. The adagio built to its climax, the resolution Julian had found in that September afternoon. The melody reached across the silence, hesitated, and then found its match. It was not a happy ending. It was not a sad one. It was an honest one. It was the sound of two people choosing each other, knowing full well what they risked. When the movement ended, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then the applause began. Not the polite, measured clapping of a society concert, but something rawer. People were on their feet. People were crying. People who had come to mock were leaving transformed. The fourth movement was a triumph. Not a conventional one. There were no victory marches or blaring trumpets. It was a triumph of endurance, of persistence, of beauty carved from difficulty. It ended not with a crashing chord, but with a single note, held by the violins, fading into silence like a star winking out at dawn. The silence stretched for 5 seconds. 10. And then the hall erupted. Arabella stood in her box, applauding until her hands stung. Julian turned from the pianoforte and looked up at her. Across the length of the hall, their eyes met. He smiled, a real smile, unguarded and joyful. And in that moment, she knew that the gamble had paid off. Afterwards, there was a reception. It had been planned by Arabella, against the advice of nearly everyone, in the great hall of a nearby hotel. She had expected a small turnout, the loyal, the curious, the brave. Instead, the room was packed. Julian was surrounded. Critics wanted to interview him. Publishers wanted to print his music. Impresarios wanted to book him for tours. He answered their questions with a distracted courtesy, his eyes constantly searching the crowd for a flash of silver-grey silk. He found her by the window, alone, a glass of champagne in her hand. "You are avoiding me," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I am giving you your moment," she replied. "You have earned it." "I have earned nothing without you." He lowered his voice. "Did you hear what they are saying? The critics are calling it a masterpiece. The publishers are offering me a fortune. They want more symphonies, concertos, chamber music, anything I will write." "And what will you tell them?" Julian took a breath. "I will tell them yes, but on my terms. And I will tell them that my first act as a successful composer is to announce my engagement." Arabella's glass stopped halfway to her lips. "Julian!" "I know what you are going to say. The scandal, the risk, the possibility that this success is a house of cards that will collapse the moment we make our private lives public. I do not care. I have spent a year writing music about courage. It is time I lived it." She set down her glass. Her hands were trembling. "They will destroy you." "Let them try. I have been destroyed before. I have lived in garrets and eaten scraps and watched my talent wither for lack of belief. I will not lose you to fear, not now. Not when I have finally found the thing that makes the music worth writing." The crowd swirled around them, oblivious. Julian took Arabella's hand, the hand that wore no ring, the hand that had given him everything, and held it between both of his. "Marry me," he said. "Not because it is safe, not because it is sensible, because it is true." Arabella looked at him for a long moment, at his ink-stained fingers, his imperfect face, his eyes full of hope and terror and love. Then she looked at the crowd, the people who had whispered, who had judged, who had tried to tear them apart. She thought of the letters, the snubs, the lonely evenings in her empty townhouse. She thought of the music, soaring and defiant, filling a hall with something real. She thought of the adagio and the resolution she had helped him find. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Julian Hart, I will marry you, and we will let them talk." He kissed her, there by the window, in full view of everyone. The room did not stop. The conversation did not cease. But a few people noticed. A few people smiled. And somewhere in the back of the hall, a violinist who had played in the orchestra that night picked up her instrument and began to play the adagio's theme, softly, as if to herself. It was not the ending anyone had expected, but it was, as Julian had once said, the beginning. Epilogue. Crescendo. They were married in a small chapel on Christmas Eve, with only Hester and a handful of loyal friends in attendance. The newspapers reported it with a mixture of scorn and fascination. Society took its time coming around. Some never did. But Julian wrote. Oh, how he wrote. The symphonies came in a flood, each one bolder than the last. The concertos followed, then the operas, then the songs that every drawing-room soprano wanted to sing. His name became synonymous with the new music. The brave music, the honest music, the music that refused to lie. And Arabella. She became his editor, his first listener, his fiercest advocate. She sat beside him at the pianoforte for every new work, her grey eyes fixed on his fingers, her head slightly tilted. She was no longer merely a patroness. She was his partner, his muse, his home. The scandal never fully died. There were always those who whispered about the Countess who had thrown away her reputation for a penniless composer. But there were more who spoke of the symphony that had changed their lives and the love that had written it into being. In the end, Julian Hart and Arabella Vane understood something that the world often forgets. That art is not made from safety, and love is not made from convenience. They are made from risk, from courage, from the willingness to stand in front of a hostile crowd and play the truth. And when the music fades, that truth remains. The end. Thank you, dear reader of the Regency Gazette, for joining us in another tale of love, intrigue, and whispered ballroom secrets. If today's romance delighted you, kindly bestow a like upon this video. It helps our Gazette reach more lovers of Regency storytelling. For weekly journeys into dukes, debutantes, scandals, and slow-burning devotion, please subscribe to the Gazette and tap the little bell so you are notified the moment the next story is published. Until our next edition, may your days be filled with grace and your nights with the promise of romance.